Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, good evening. If you are joining, we'll wait a few minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, just to allow others to join before we get started. If you are here, I see a few people already have. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Oh, we have someone joining mid. Awesome. A few people in Boston. Got a couple here on the East Coast. Alrighty, thank you for putting in and introducing yourself to the chat. We'll go ahead and get started this afternoon, again, morning, evening. Welcome to today's webinar this afternoon, hosted by the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And those of you who have joined us previously, welcome back. My name is Kiana Dixson. I am the pharmacist and the Associate Director of Educational Programs here at the ACMA. This afternoon, we will be discussing standards in the pharmaceutical industry with two leaders within medical affairs. And today, our panelists on this topic, again, are two leaders within the industry, and I am delighted to introduce them. We have Dr. William Soliman, the founder and CEO of ACMA, and Dr. Kimberly Cremers, founder and CEO of Petrichor Medical Affairs Consulting. In order just to give you a bit more of a background on our speakers before we get started, you may have seen Will, as he is often featured in the media in outlets such as Fox News, Forbes, Yahoo Business TV, and also ABC News Radio. Dr. Soliman earned his bachelor's from New York University and his PhD from Columbia University. He has over 20 years of experience in the life sciences industry, including directing multiple field medical teams, leading the medical affairs strategy of multiple pharmaceutical organizations and products. Dr. Cremers is also a pharmacist and humanitarian with more than 20 years of medical affairs experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. After receiving her bachelor's in pharmacy from Ohio State University and her doctorate of pharmacy from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Sciences, she has successfully led medical affairs team in multiple companies. She's been working with products across the life cycle and in a variety of therapeutic areas. Currently, through consulting, Dr. Cremers offers comprehensive strategic guidance and support for organizations that need to expand that medical affairs function by applying her wisdom and her insights from decades of working in-house for organizations like Amgen, Sandoz, and UCB, just to name a few, in both field-based roles and also headquarter roles. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Everyone, welcome our speakers. We at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, we have a mission, and that is to establish a higher level of global independent standards of excellence across the board throughout the pharmaceutical environment, through the industry, and also in medical affairs. A little more about us. The ACMA was founded almost 10 years ago, and our mission, again, is to set standards and a benchmark of excellence through certification, and also enable our client partners to meet their business goals by leveraging training of minimum competency standards, services like our AI-enabled digital solutions that we have, and also through accreditation. We have deep experience, both in the US and also globally. Currently, we have over 25,000 users in over 80 countries. We work closely with over 200 biopharmaceutical companies where we have helped them across multiple fields, medical affairs, market access, also commercial. Okay. We are the first and only accrediting body for the pharma industry, and users see a greater than 80% improvement in their knowledge after they have completed our programs. A recent report from McKinsey indicated that 81% of physicians are not happy with the interaction that they have with pharma. A major reason for this was that HCPs, healthcare providers, they questioned pharma's credibility. They oftentimes representatives of the industry were biased, and they didn't see them as true peers. And this is why accreditation is so critical. It builds that layer of foundation of trust and credibility. The difference with the ACMA is that we are a fully accredited organization through International Accreditors for Continuing Education and Training, or ISET. So by working with accredited providers like ACMA, you gain peace of mind, which translates into better compliance, right? It confirms that a rigorous vetted process is in place within your organization to meet highest standards of excellence, right? So we have familiarity with accreditation, and that leads us to our topic today. Our conversation and discussion today is how can we pioneer standards of compliance while enhancing the medical affairs function within pharma? Okay, so in order to guide the conversation today, we will discuss compliance in the pharmaceutical industry first. We'll dive into a discussion with our speakers this afternoon on the medical affairs role in upholding compliance in the pharma industry, as well as the need for accrediting medical affairs teams. All right, are we ready to get started? Now let's dive into compliance. We first have to understand, right, what compliance is and what that looks like in the industry. Okay, the pharmaceutical industry has a prominent role in scientific innovation. That should be your first thought, right, when you think of the pharmaceutical industry's role. Each component in this industry or within an organization has the goal of improving global health through development and distribution of drugs, life-saving products. And so in the healthcare landscape, the pharma industry bridges that gap between scientific innovation and also the patient's well-being. Yet this pursuit is noble, is not without its challenges. So pharmaceutical companies must navigate complex challenges, like not staying knowledgeable on changing regulatory landscapes, ethical considerations, and also the need for upholding data integrity. And we're going to dive into each of these challenges for the pharma company later in this webinar. Again, we focus on medical affairs, and within this industry, medical affairs as a team plays an indispensable role in contributing to informed decision-making, right? Both internally among other teams and also externally with healthcare providers. So some of these roles in medical affairs, for example, may be used to generate real-world evidence, lead scientific exchange with HCPs, right, in that dissemination of data. In order to ultimately safeguard patient safety and maintaining that integrity of the industry, compliance in the pharmaceutical industry is essential, right, to ensure the pharmaceutical companies actually adhere to specific set standards. Right, so some of those standards that pharma companies must adhere to relate to regulatory aspects, ethical considerations, and again, data integrity standards. And we're going to review these three types of compliance in the industry more in depth. And then we'll bring in our speakers to discuss more the role of medical affairs in each standard of compliance. Alrighty, so first up, regulatory. Regulatory compliance in the pharmaceutical industry involves adherence to the regulations and guidelines that are set forth by health authorities in that region, right? Such as the FDA here in the US, the EMA in Europe, Health Canada in Canada, right? And other relevant regulatory bodies in those regions. And these regulations that are set forth govern various aspects of drug development, manufacturing, marketing, and distribution, again, across the life cycle of the drug development and a drug's life cycle, right, to ensure that product safety and efficacy. Now, a question I'd like to pose to our speakers here, Will and Kim, from your perspective, how does medical affairs as a function support in maintaining regulatory compliance for an organization?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think thank you for the opportunity to participate today. the FDA does outline their expectations of pharmaceutical companies, including medical affairs, and the company itself should have SOPs and guidelines in which the standards that they want to work by. And so understanding what those standards are and then executing against those standards is critically important.
So really good point, Kim. So within those SOPs, what type of information should be included in these SOPs that relate to regulatory compliance, would you say?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it would be how to conduct scientific exchange. What are the expectations? What are the environment in which that will be okay? What are the audience members look like? As well as things like advisory boards, having a question that needs to be asked to advisors, the right advisors, getting an answer to that question, doing something with that answer. So those are outlined, I think, pretty clearly by the guidelines put forth by the FDA and should be embedded in SOPs for the company, specifically medical affairs.
Yeah, I agree. Will, did you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I think, ultimately, when we look at what medical affairs does, it's involved in generating new information and disseminating that information. And so anytime you are looking at compliance, specifically to medical affairs, you need to look at, is your company doing a good job of regulating those two aspects? There's a lot more detail, of course, on the back end with companies, especially now the evolution of digital tools and technology and what's happening there, and how to make sure that you're using those tools appropriately. Right, that's in a whole other dimension. But I think those are like the main two, I would say, areas. Right, when you think about compliance, is the medical affairs organization properly and ethically and objectively providing information to healthcare providers, whether that's through the field medical team, through medical information requests, so forth and so on. And then internally, in-house medical affairs, as we call it, are they implementing processes and protocols to make sure that the data they're generating is being generated in an objective, ethical, unbiased way? And that gets into things like, what the process is for the generation of data, let's say for IISs or phase 4, right? Things like that. So that's a whole other area that I think is really, really very key. I think if you have those two areas covered adequately, then generally you're in good shape. But the reason why medical affairs, I think, plays such an important role, to go back to your original question, is that there's a lot of visibility on medical affairs now more than ever. And so I think it behooves everyone in the industry on the compliance side to make sure they are operating at the industry standard.
I agree. It's a really good point that you made, bringing in discussing the different functions within medical affairs, like medical information, and how they work cross-functionally with other teams, right? Within commercial, within marketing, those also have to be monitored in order to uphold those regulatory standards as well.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. So the speakers mentioned that medical affairs teams, specifically, right, field-based medical, they engage in scientific exchange, those discussions with HCPs or healthcare providers. Ethical conduct in compliance terms involves upholding high moral and ethical standards in all those activities, including those interactions with HCPs. So this really includes transparency, honesty, integrity, right, and the avoidance of conflicts of interest that could compromise patient safety or the integrity of scientific data. Now, this question is posed to the speakers, and how can medical affairs support in upholding ethical conduct? Will, you mentioned investigator-initiated studies. How can we maintain that the conflict of interest is mitigated or that risk is mitigated when speaking with potential IIS investigators?
So, obviously one of the big things I think is to make sure that we're kind of hands off when it comes to the information or the topics and the design of the study, et cetera, right? That's a common practice. But I think there's a bigger issue here, and you mentioned here Pharma Code and EFPIA. The thing is this, right? There are actually companies now that are leaving Pharma, the trade organization. Kim and I were just talking about that before we opened up the show. And so, the question is, what really is the role that Pharma is going to play in the United States specifically as it relates to companies in terms of how they do business with healthcare professionals. How, what is that really going to mean long term? And I personally think that that model is archaic. It's going to be outdated very soon. And the reason is that we live today in a society where corporations have an ethical responsibility and a social responsibility to the public. And ultimately, if you look at what pharma is doing, it really is it's a membership model where pharma companies pay membership fees to the patient, and they're really self-regulating themselves. That's basically what's happening. It works to some degree, but I think ultimately we need to look at more objective ways to help pharmaceutical companies really make sure they're being ethical and they're operating with integrity, with transparency, and there's a level setting, the kind of a structured framework for how they do business across the industry.
Yeah, I agree. I think that framework is really important. I think, where it comes from, has its pros and cons. I think at the end of the day, to be able to turn to a document, a standard that outlines the proper way or the agreed upon way to do business, I think is really important. Whether that's for teams that have been existing for many years or decades, perhaps, going back to, the keel, if you will, getting level set again on the way to move forward, maybe after an incident occurred, but having a place to go to see what that expectation is clearly outlined, and then as a company to interpret from that framework, I think is really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that, what we've tended to focus on in the pharmaceutical industry have really been the pharmaceutical sales reps, right? That's been really the focus because for a lot of reasons. But what people don't realize is that medical affairs professionals in the field, they're the ones that are actually getting all the time with physicians, not the pharmaceutical sales representatives, right? They're getting a very, very short period of time, usually, 1 or 2 minutes with a doctor on average. So what I would say, I would put forth and posit that really the medical affairs, field medical affairs especially, they're the ones that are having a tremendous impact on clinical decision making and informing the healthcare community of the latest and greatest when it comes to scientific developments and research and whatnot with the product. So to me, that should really be the primary focus. And it is, right? When at least, it's getting, I shouldn't say it is, it's probably getting there. I've had a lot of conversations on the Hill. So, as part of the work that we do at the ACMA, we believe in the good work that the pharmaceutical industry does, and we advocate for the professionals in the industry. We've been called a few times to go to Capitol Hill. In 2021, we spoke before Congress Health Subcommittee, and these issues came up. And to be honest, at the time when we first started these conversations, most people couldn't tell the difference between a pharmaceutical sales representative and a medical science liaison. No one really understood what that difference was. But there is a difference. There's a key difference. And I think as we have more specialty, products coming to the market, more complex drugs when it comes to the mechanism of action, a greater interplay between pharmacogenomics and devices and different drug delivery systems. Our understanding has just grown so much more sophisticated that we're relying more on people with advanced clinical degrees like, Kim or myself when we were in the industry. So I think that really means that we need to look carefully at what medical affairs is doing and make sure that we're operating at the highest standards of integrity.
And I think you talk about big picture, right? You're talking about being on the Hill and having conversations and ensuring that the difference between medical and sales is quite evident to the policymakers, which is critically important. Day to day, we've got these teams out there having conversations about and maintaining that ethical approach to those conversations with scientific exchange, ensuring that it's fair and balanced, to maintain that clear ethical line between the bias of here's what I think you should do, or this is the best place to use this medicine, but to really sticking to the evidence that's available to them, being fair and balanced with the information. So we're spending as much time talking about safety as we are about efficacy, ensuring we're providing a totality of information, not just cherry-picked information. So while we're looking at this at a big picture, which is critically important, we also have to execute on that in every conversation that we have to ensure that we maintain our integrity day to day.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kim.
Yes. And Kim, you actually explained really our next point, that third sector of the compliance, right? Data integrity. You mentioned this, that data integrity pertains to the accuracy and reliability of data, right? That's collected and maintained through that drug development life cycle. Ensuring that this integrity is crucial for making informed decisions about drug safety and efficacy. This is important because HCPs, right, we use evidence-based medicine to guide treatment. If we can't trust the evidence, the source, imagine how this could affect our patient population. So it really drives home that accreditation and understanding compliance at each level and each stage through the drug's life cycle is very important ultimately for the patient in the end.
Yeah. When I think about data integrity, I think it starts with the investigators we choose to work with, right? Medical Affairs has a role in that in many situations. In many companies, we might be making a suggestion as to who those investigators are. We need to work with good investigators to make sure that the integrity of the data that's coming in on a day-to-day basis, a patient-by-patient visit, is at the highest standard, right? Working with closely with strong investigators that understand the importance of adhering to the protocol quite closely. From there, we get the data into the company, of course, and we want to make sure that we're evaluating it in a non-biased way, not just looking for the answers that we want to see, but the answers that are actually there. And then, of course, it's communicating that information through scientific exchange to the people who need to know it when they need to know it, right? And that needs to be directly to investigators initially until those questions get asked and the data is available more broadly.
That's a really good point. You know, the dissemination of data that was generated, the dissemination includes scientific exchange as well as tangible deliverables as well, like publications, scientific publications, which also should be maintained and uphold to certain standards.
Yeah, we certainly rely on our authors to help us with that, right? Getting very involved with it, ensuring that the data that's published represents the totality of the publication in an accurate and fair balanced manner as well.
Yes, very important points. Well, did you have anything to add on data integrity with medical affairs?
No, I think, Kim hit the nail on the head. No, nothing to add. Yep. I think, what she said, I absolutely agree with. I think it's key.
I agree. Now, from your expertise of leading field medical teams and consulting in medical affairs, I'd like to pose a question to you both as to what actions or responsibilities have you come across that run an increased risk of non-compliance among medical affairs professionals, right? Will mentioned earlier, like using outdated sources, activities, right? So what activities have you seen that may have an increased risk of non-compliance?
I mean, I could start. I think oftentimes it's unintentional. I would say the majority of the people working in the pharma industry, I was just actually on a podcast about this. They're not trying to, manipulate people or present a biased picture on purpose. I don't think that's happening most of the time. I think most people are trying to do the right thing. So I think a lot of the times it's unintentional due to maybe a poor lack of guidance or training or a good structure that's been put in place or a framework to help them. Like the other day I was talking to a company and they were interested in trying to figure out how they could partner with the ACMA. And, the company in this particular example, they were collecting information and insights in a way that actually puts them at potential risk. Now, they weren't aware of that it could put them at a potential compliance risk, but the way in which they were doing it, from whether it was related to the fact that they were using kind of outdated systems to do that or the information they were putting in. So again, it's unintentional, but ultimately, if the company, God forbid, gets audited, for sure that's going to come up as a red flag and a problem. So I think oftentimes, again, like it goes back to what we were saying earlier, having some type of structured framework in place, which is why I'm a big believer of certification and standards in the industry. It helps to make sure that there's guardrails. And that then helps to make sure that everybody's kind of on a level playing field when it comes to the work that they're carrying out in medical affairs.
I agree. Well, I don't think that people routinely go out saying, how can I be non-compliant today by any stretch? But I think it all comes down to good training. And I think it's not only about reading SOP and signing off and saying, I understand it, but being challenged on what you read in that SOP. How are you going to apply the information? how do we work on a daily basis and integrate this information into the work that we do and the expectations that we have of our team. So for me, I really like to partner with compliance. I think it's kind of like going to the principal's office sometimes. When you see compliance show up on a call, you're like, uh-oh, what do we do wrong? What new guidance are we going to get? But it shouldn't be that way, right? If they're true partners and they're routinely on your team calls, if that's on a monthly basis or something, and they're there, that they become your partner and you're not intimidated by having a conversation with them. So if you bring them into the mix, and when you're putting out a new innovative idea as a leadership team, tossing around the right way to move a particular goal forward, or having examples embedded in your training, and then being challenged as you stretch the muscle or the understanding muscle for your compliance, and you build that muscle just like you would exercising, right? When you are challenged in a different way in the field, in a particular setting, you have all of that good information and all of that why behind the reasons you do or don't do things in your court. And when you're challenged in a situation, you can then pull on that experience, pull on that training, pull on that information to make the best decision you can at the time when a situation you couldn't have planned for comes up. So I think to avoid being non-compliant, it's spending time talking about what is compliant and why, and building that muscle.
Yeah, and I was going to say, unfortunately, there are times where compliance doesn't understand the business. Let's face it. I mean, that's the truth, right? Sometimes I've been in situations where the compliance folks, again, they mean well. Their job is to mitigate risk. But there are cases where they just simply don't understand the business well enough and what we're trying to accomplish. And so they do put up these, rules and regulations internally within the company that I would say could actually stifle the business in certain cases where there really isn't necessarily a major risk that's involved. So sometimes we tend to overcompensate sometimes, I think, in the industry, and that can actually be frustrating. I think actually that can cause a backlash, right? Because that can make people very frustrated and then actually not trust in the credibility of compliance. That's another reason why I think there needs to be a clear kind of structured framework that everybody agrees upon, that this is kind of how we want to do business, generally speaking. Certainly there's going to be nuances from company to company, but generally speaking. One example that comes to mind, there was a company a few years ago, just recently, a big pharma company that allegedly had misused the speaker program, right? So physicians, are hired to be speakers, oftentimes by pharmaceutical companies. And this particular company was not using the right criteria, let's say, to pick their speakers. One can ask, was this intentional? Was it not? And it turns out in this particular case, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some people were not aware that they should have been really picking the physicians based on certain criteria. Some were. There wasn't really clear communication channels. So again, it was a lack of good SOPs in terms of procedures and processes, and there's a kind of a breakdown in communication. But regardless, the company was fined. I think it was like $700 million because they were, non-compliant when it came to their physician speaker program. And that's, that's important, right? Because ultimately, if you're picking speakers, let's say, because, of how much they're prescribing, that's probably a bad idea. And if you're picking speakers that aren't aware of the rules and regulations around compliance in the pharmaceutical industry, that's probably a bad idea. What are you doing, to make sure that you're, covering that base? Which is one of the reasons actually at the ACMA, some time ago, we developed a program which is actually for key opinion leaders, external experts. It's actually a program that certifies them on knowledge in the pharmaceutical industry. It's called KOL Speaker Certification. And so companies will actually put their key opinion leaders, external experts, through our program to make sure that they understand all the rules and regulations of being a speaker in the pharmaceutical industry. So again, it could be internal, but it could also be external, and what you're doing externally and how you're communicating that to the external stakeholders. So again, several factors there that are involved, but I do think that making sure that compliance really understands what medical affairs does. Some companies, especially if they're smaller, don't have the resources to have a specific compliance officer for medical affairs. So that sometimes they're sharing that compliance officer across different functional areas. And my experience has been, especially at smaller companies, that they don't always understand what we're trying to do, how we're different maybe than sales or regulatory or whatnot. So again, I think that education about what medical affairs does, what we're trying to accomplish, putting that kind of in perspective also plays a key factor.
Yes, definitely. All great points. And that's, a webinar like this is why this is very important, right? So that those compliance officers, they can actually understand medical affairs and how they can support the compliance side. Now we're going to go over, we'll mention a few examples as to what happens, right, when non-compliance occurs. Over the years, there have been many similar settlements that have cost companies hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're just going to review a few instances where companies have faced legal actions, right, due to lapses in compliance. So here's an example where a significant fine was imposed on one pharmaceutical company for improper publication activities, right, in light of negative studies. And this really applies to that data integrity piece that we discussed when it comes to compliance. They didn't report accurate and true safety data regarding their new product and promoted the drug for unapproved uses. And this organization was fined $3 billion with a B. And another example, one organization, when failing to comply with their REMS program, that Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies program, this company's commercial nurse educators were accused of white coat marketing. And they use this to promote drugs and assumably or presumably make sales agreements to other healthcare providers. And this company, they agreed at a fine to pay $58 million in settlements. And that leads us to ACMA's role currently when working specifically with medical affairs departments or teams to accredit the entire medical affairs team, again, as an organization. So after the discussion we have had so far, the question that's posed is why accredit an organization or team? And what we've seen, what we've discussed so far is that accreditation plays a crucial role in enhancing patient care, right? By standardizing those processes, offering a structured framework, right, for program management to foster that culture of excellence. It really instills confidence in HCPs, healthcare providers, and patients, medical affairs teams internally, provides that peace of mind, right, during audits if you're on the compliance team. And it really creates a unified and loyal team within the organization. So ACMA, we now have organizational accreditation standards that are set forth for medical affairs teams. Then my question next is to Will. How did this need for accreditation of medical affairs teams come about? Can you give us some insight or tell us how this journey began?
Sure. So as many of you guys know that are on the call, ACMA, began really with the first ever accredited board certification for medical affairs and MSL professionals back in 2016. And that was very well received to the point that today, as Kiana pointed out earlier on in the webinar, we have now thousands of users in 80 countries. We work with 200 pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that would come up all the time as we would talk to companies and as part of our research was the fact that companies oftentimes did not have good processes in place and a structured framework when it came to doing business within medical affairs specifically. So it wasn't just about the individual, right, who we were accrediting or certifying, but it was now about the processes, the steps, let's say, that they take for a particular project or outcome, how they're using digital tools, how they're going to leverage AI, how they are going to go about developing, let's say, phase 4 studies, whatever it is within medical affairs. And ultimately, we felt that it was really key to develop something that would be ubiquitously used across the industry, that would help organizations kind of set or level set rather a standard for the whole field within medical affairs. And that really was the genesis of the idea. The idea ultimately was if we could provide good guidances that's data driven for medical affairs organization, and that would ensure that all companies are kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, this could really help to elevate the industry as a whole. And that's really the premise behind it.
Now, as we mentioned, we have the 14 states for accreditation. I'm sorry, Will, I'll go ahead and open the floor to you here.
Yeah, I was going to say, so, this is one of the things that, I'm personally very excited about. So, we've developed these 14 standards of accreditation. As you could see in these standards, you have standards covering everything from governance to, again, digital technology, basic ethics and compliance, scientific communication, publications, you name it, it's there. And so to me, this is really the most comprehensive accreditation standards for medical affairs organization really ever developed. And if you look at the amount of work that went in and the time that went in to develop this, it's really unprecedented in our industry. And again, remember, prior to our organization, there was no accrediting standards or accreditation within medical affairs. So I think this is really the culmination of a lot of years of data collection, a lot of time that went in to think about carefully what were the things that were really key to every medical affairs organization. This is what really these 14 standards represent. But I'd love to hear Kim's perspective on it as well.
Yeah, so I think the standards really outline the expectations. They've been pulled from historical information that's already been discussed on this call about where folks went wrong, companies went wrong, and really developing these to be open and honest expectations for medical affairs organizations. I think about these as very important and valuable for, as Will mentioned earlier, companies that are new, maybe building their medical affairs organizations. Maybe they need to really talk about the value of medical affairs to the leadership who maybe have been working on developing molecules but haven't been close to the commercialization process before, and the value of medical affairs. And so these standards help outline what a good medical affairs organization should encompass. They're transparent. They give information about, in your own company and how it will work for you, but some definite guidelines on what is critically important to a medical affairs organization. This will help companies work with their colleagues, whether it's R&D or commercial, to understand what the expectations are for a solid accredited medical affairs organization. And it's pretty comprehensive, looking at not only internal conversations, external conversations, but also within the teams in medical affairs, and what does a good team look like, and what does that training look like as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think, Kim covered a lot of the points here on this slide. If you go to the next slide, we kind of get into how do you get the accreditation through the ACMA. So it's pretty simple. Basically, ACMA has its own accreditation portal. You would submit documentation to demonstrate that you fulfill all of the requirements for each of the 14 standards. And then from there, once you get fully accredited, you would get an official ACMA accreditation seal that you'd be able to utilize. And then from there, on an annual basis, there's an annual attestation that basically says that the company is going to commit to uphold these standards. And I think that's very important. Then there's a reaccreditation process every 5 years. So obviously, if something happens in the mix there where there's something that lapses and the company is not upholding the standards, of course, we have the right to withdraw the accreditation. So it's pretty straightforward, like most other accrediting bodies. You simply provide documentation, we review it, and then we accredit the organization. And again, it's all done via a secure portal. That's an online portal that the ACMA has developed. If you go to the next slide, you might be wondering, okay, why should I do this? I think the question is, if you're running medical affairs, if you're in medical affairs, do you want to establish a culture of excellence? Do you want to have very strong medical affairs governance where you're operating at the industry level? Not internally that, you're kind of looking at it yourself and measuring it, but to know, am I really, as my team and my organization, operating at the industry level? I think this is going to become very key, this organizational accreditation. So it, again, elevates credibility. I think this goes a long way. Again, if God forbid you're audited as an organization, from a compliance perspective, this is huge. To be able to turn around and say, look, we have put in place something not developed by us, by an external body that says, yes, we've met certain standards. I think it also inspires innovation and drives better outcomes. It's going to create a more unified and versatile team. I think that is so important, especially I would say post-COVID, where many people now, they used to be in-house, we call them in-house. Many of those people now are hybrid or fully remote. And what I hear all the time from leaders is it's tough to really, develop that unified culture of oneness, if you will, within medical affairs. This can help do that. This can help do that because you have to put double the effort in when you're remote when it comes to communicating and working together. It's very different than being in person. So it also provides a roadmap that you're going to have now for ongoing team improvement. So again, to Kim's point, if you're building a medical affairs organization, if you're expanding the organization, if you're looking to really help transform what you already have, this, in my opinion, is an absolute must. And it gives you, again, risk management, right? It's going to help you manage and mitigate risk and ultimately give you that peace of mind. Right now, if you're operating, internally with your own standards, your own SOPs, you only know what you know. You don't know what's out there, and what we've discovered within the industry is really key. If you go to the next slide, are you stuck there at this slide? The next slide is really just, I wanted to open up the floor for any questions that the attendees might have about organizational accreditation. So again, while you guys are thinking of questions, again, this is something that is not for an individual. This is where a medical affairs division would actually get accredited through the ACMA. It's very similar to, if you've worked in a hospital setting, like a JCO type of accreditation for a hospital, it's kind of the same premise. And remember, the ACMA is actually accredited by ISAT-ANSI, which is the same accrediting body that accredits JCO, which the Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals. So let's see if we have any questions.
I did see a comment here. This is a great opportunity for companies to create specific training, focus on specific team risk postures and how they are related to the industry standards and guidelines. Reminders and scenarios can help drive home applicability of legalese and many guidelines. Companies differ greatly, and one size does not fit all.
Yeah, I think that's an important comment. There's a question I see here from James. What is the difference between, what does that say, MSL
versus
BCMAS? I'm holding MD, so which one? If you could clarify, James, what you mean. MSL stands for Medical Science Liaison.
I think what James is asking is, an MSL is a role at a company, and there are certain roles and responsibilities in which they execute scientific exchange. BCMAS is an additional certification, and I think that's something that Will could speak to.
Yeah, so BCMAS, which is the Board Certified Medical Affairs Specialist Program, it's a board certification designed for MSLs and medical affairs professionals. So if you're an MD, it looks like, and you're looking to build a career as a medical science liaison, getting BCMAS certainly is going to help you tremendously. How many teams have done the accreditation already? So as of now, no one has done it. This is completely brand new. We've just launched the organizational accreditation. So this is a new offering from the ACMA. Like I said, we've got a lot of folks that are interested. So we're in those discussions now. But up to date, no one has implemented it yet, as it's a new offering from our organization. You're welcome, James.
Yeah, I'd like to address Melody's point here. I think you make a good point about, companies differ greatly, and they do differ greatly, and they're different sizes and remits and therapeutic areas, but ultimately the standards apply to any company, and maybe more so in certain stages as you become closer to a launch, perhaps, than if you're just starting a company and starting medical affairs. Maybe you layer on some of these standards, and some of the depth that you go into each one of the standards may vary, but these are very malleable to a broader group of companies. It's not a one size fits all, or it is a one size fits all, if you will, but letting your company be individual within those standards, as long as you're meeting specific expectations.
There's a question: can an organization in Pakistan providing medical affairs services get the accreditation? Yes. So we work globally, like I mentioned. In 80 countries currently. We have learners, and we do business all the time around the world. So the answer is yes to that question. Nancy asks, can you elaborate on the training for this enterprise-wide certification for medical affairs? So I think what Nancy's referring to is the BCMAS certification for enterprise implementation. It's a great question. So this is something that we do all the time. So oftentimes companies will come to the ACMA and say, hey, we want to train 200 people and certify them with the ACMA. And so this is something that we do. Typically what happens is the difference, when it comes to enterprise certification is that you have a dedicated account manager that'll work with your company. You would have a year of access versus 6 months. Usually individuals only will get 6 months of access if you enroll on your own, but as a company, you get a year of access. Oftentimes the companies will do a subscription type of setup where they'll subscribe to the platform. We have our own learning platform, and they'll do that instead because oftentimes they're hiring new folks and expanding. So they want to have access to the content routinely, and then you get a certain number of licenses that you can use to certify, whatever number of individuals that you're looking to certify. So hopefully that helped to answer your question, Nancy. Let's see, are we missing any other questions here? Is the cost based on team size? Orlando asked. The organizational accreditation cost is not based on team size, if you're referring to that. So this is just a simple flat fee annually, or rather not annually, but initially that you pay for the accreditation. It's not based on how big the organization is. So that has nothing to do with it. Now let's see the bottom question there. I see Bert. How does the right to try act offered by the FDA approvals when it comes to real world evidence? I'm not sure I understand that question, Kim. I don't know if you do. How does the right to try act affect FDA approvals? Do you know what he's referring to?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't have to take a look and see. Sorry about that, Bert. Any other questions, Kiana, that you see here? I think we covered them all.
I don't see any. I think we've hit on every question that's been submitted here in the chat. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to info@acmainfo.org. Go ahead and close out the webinar here now. But I did want to mention that everyone that attended this webinar this afternoon, you have access to a free downloadable resource. One of our white papers is entitled Organizational Accreditation for Medical Affairs. The time is now. So look for that in your box at the conclusion of the webinar. It's a really interesting read and covers a lot of the information that the speaker spoke on today. And with that, I will leave you to have a great rest of your day and a great week.
Excellent.
Bye, guys.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.